Everyone, welcome to the SiliconExpert Webinar series of various topics in the industries where we bring in guest speakers. Today our focus is going to be on counterfeit electronic component detection and avoidance. I still see quite a few people still joining, so we'll wait just a moment to have at least the quorum. We have a high number of attendees. Happy to say this seems to be our best attended one yet. The numbers do keep growing. So we'll get started in just a few moments here as we'll let the attendees joining counter kind of slow down and settle down a little bit. While we're doing that, a couple of housekeeping issues. If you're fairly new to GoToWebinar and GoToMeeting, you can minimize the chat window in the screen. There's a small window attached to the main window that has an arrow at the top of it. So when you mouse over that arrow, it will say Hide Control Panel, and when you click on it, it will minimize the window without kicking you out of the meeting. You can also submit questions via this GoToMeeting window as well. We will check for questions at points throughout the webinar, and then at the end try to answer as many of them as we can in the allotted time. All right. Well, I still see some stragglers kind of joining, but we'll go ahead and get started. So this slide kind of speaks to what I was just saying. You can use the questions section of the GoToMeeting window in order to ask questions. We'll be monitoring that and trying to answer as many questions as we can. If we are unable to get to all of them, we'll answer them individually by email. A common question is, can we see the slides? So you don't need to ask that one. We will make the presentation available to all the attendees. There will be a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please let us know, what you liked, how you felt. We're going to have a large mix of both existing customers and those who are maybe not so familiar with SiliconExpert. If you kind of like what you see and you want the opportunity to try it out for a while, let us know that in the survey questions. And we'll make arrangements to get people some evaluation access if they're not using us already. So a very quick introduction. I still see quite a few attendees, joining here a couple of minutes late. So you haven't missed anything for those of you just now joining. After a short intro, Dr. Das will do his presentation, about 25 minutes. I may not use all 25 minutes of mine for the high-level demo. It will certainly focus on the counterfeit aspect of our tool, and then we'll have some additional Q&A at the end. This is my contact information. My name's Jeff Williams. I'm your moderator today, and there's my email address. If there's any follow-up comments, questions, or calls, I'd be happy to address those. A little bit about SiliconExpert. You might say this is the commercial word from our sponsor. We've been around since the year 2000. This has been our sole purpose in life, is to build a database of electronic component information software tools so that you can query the database and upload and process bills of materials. And also we have a professional services team as well. The high-level statistics, 250+ million parts, roughly 12,000 suppliers, 300 people behind the scenes keeping the database up to date and current, always adding new things and updating existing things like our counterfeit reports and risk assessments and life cycle obsolescence. More recently, we've added things like country of origin. We've got requests to add things like reliability data that we are currently working on as well. course, all the environmental, whether it's ROSE and REACH and halogen-free and lead-free and things like that. You know, pretty much everything you need to know in terms of technical, life cycle, environmental, counterfeit, alternates, documents, product change notices, etc. So with that as sort of the intro and a little bit about what SiliconExpert has and does, I am pleased to now pass the baton over to Dr. Diganta Das. He's with the Center for Advanced Lifecycle Engineering at the University of Maryland, and he will be making his presentation on counterfeit detection and avoidance.
Thanks, Jeff. If you can make me the presenter. Okay, you did.
All right, you should have it ready to go now. And we can see your screen.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on wherever you are. I am Diganta Das. I'm with Center for Advanced Lifecycle Engineering at University of Maryland. My email address is right on this page, and you will have that as a copy of this presentation. In many cases, I'm pretty sure you will need to or want to know names and contacts of people regarding topics that I'm mentioning. I did not feel it appropriate to just list their names here. And so if you have any such questions, feel free to contact me at my email address or through SiliconExpert. I will definitely pass those on to you individually. With that, let me go on to what my expected topics of coverage today. I just did my CALCE SMTA Counterfeit Symposium, which I do once or twice a year, and I just feel compelled to share a little bit what we learned from there. Then I will go through some items regarding counterfeiting beyond electronics, although we are, and SiliconExpert also is primarily concerned with electronic components, but it's not the only thing. Do we know how much is the extent of electronics counterfeiting, and do we need to? And as we go along, you can read through that list. If we run short of time for any reason, particularly it might be for my verbosity, the last item, that is the authentication tools, may be something that we will skip, although you will have the presentation in your hand when you get the copy of it. So we are a research center in the mechanical engineering department at University of Maryland, and our primary work had always been on electronics reliability and also on electronics component management and part selection and management. And of course, the issue of counterfeit electronics throws a wrench into this whole issue of electronics reliability and supply chain management, and that's why we have gone into researching on and working on in this area and collaboratively with a lot of people in the industry. And although I did not check all the people who are online, I'm sure with many of yours and your companies too. Let me quickly define what is a counterfeit electronic part, and this is not necessarily, actually it is not the same that you might see in many standards. All I'm saying here is I look at a counterfeit part as a component engineer, not as a lawyer, not as an investigator. So I want to just make sure that I'm getting the part that I need for my product. So from that point of view, an identity misrepresentation of an electronic part that may create problem for me would be if the manufacturer, part number, lot code, reliability level, or even the documentation is presented incorrectly. So this conference that I held, it was 2 weeks back now. Yeah, so we had 16 different presentations from many parts of the industry, from law enforcement to nitty-gritty of material characterization. We held 2 panel discussions and 2 workshops. And it's not a large conference, as in filling a convention hall, but it's of a reasonable size where you can both meet and greet people of all sorts of places. For the attendees, the CALCE members, and the subscribers, I have the presentations available at that symposium location. Now, if you have question on how to get access and is confused, you can always email me and I can point out to you how to get access. So what are the things that we had learned in particular? In 2 weeks back, actually, right now about a month back, the US DoD and came out with its rules, which are the Defense Federal Acquisition Rules, DFAR rules, and they were released and discussed. So quite a bit of discussion went there. And all these learnings I'm talking about, I'm not going to be able to go into full details. It will take all the time. That was a big issue, but that is an issue primarily for the prime contractors to the government and then who supply to the prime contractors. It's primarily assignment of responsibility from the point of view of the government. Now, although I like that they are trying to clarify things, we should just understand it on our own. Those rules by itself is not going to change either the supply or demand of the counterfeit parts, but it just makes it clear who is responsible if something's going to happen. And over time, that process may help. Second item, which is in bold, because I'm going to discuss it in more detail, is that Society for Automotive Engineers have been working on counterfeit-related standards for a while, and that process is getting mature and covering more areas. And I believe that provides people with a level playing field within the supply chain on how to address some of the issues. We may not agree on them, but it will provide a level playing field. We have heard from several companies who came up with technologies, or in many cases what I would consider measurement and characterization tools that can distinguish between components. Note this, it's not necessarily only between a good component and a counterfeit component, but between components. And depending on whether they're supposed to be different or supposed to stay the same, those tools can be used for our future. Another concern that is true for all of us and just was starting to be developed this time is issues on what you call cyber physical systems and what is not a cyber physical system now. Of course, from electrical grid to what you call Internet of Things to everything can be that way. And so counterfeit parts is a portion of that, but we are getting more concerned about that again and again, and we have heard about mock attacks on electrical grids in recent past. So that had been one of the issues being discussed, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in future. We heard about some of the material authentication enabling technologies. Now also some what I call built-in authentication methods, that is, we have every metal part as it is made leaves a material signature and a processing signature in it. The point is, how can I make a baseline of and then use that information in future for determining whether a part is authentic or not. And finally, this one issue that counterfeiting goes beyond electronics and impacts all engineered goods. That had been one of the concerns, and I'll have several examples of those as we get along. Some of the areas of controversy, one of the big controversy, and I would say most contentious topic, was the whole issue of electronic part tagging, which for some of the parts which has been mandated by the Defense Logistics Agency for US DoD purchases. That's proved to be a very contentious topic, and we will need a lot more technological solutions and supply chain solutions there before that can be a topic of that benefits everybody. Second is the issue of whether the government's role in prevention of counterfeiting. And just one of the example is, so there had been a lot of demand from, I would say, the audience, that whenever there is an issue of prosecution of people on counterfeit related issues, people want to know that that government releases the names of the other customers of that company who is prosecuted, so that people can judge their risk exposure coming from that company. Third issue, which is either a big concern or not at all, that was not a fully resolved issue, is are we starting to see now not just changes in part by remarking or even repackaging, but creating complete new clones of a part which will be from material to electrical characteristics a perfect copy, and based on reverse engineering or industrial espionage. And is that going to be something we have to be ready for? And if that becomes an issue, then many of our current counterfeit detection tools will probably not be adequate for handling that. And finally, this is always an issue, that is reporting of counterfeit incidences, whether to report and to whom. Actually, as I mentioned, the deferred rules, now the deferred rules require some level of reporting under certain circumstances, but again the issue remains whether to report and to whom. With that, I will move on. I mentioned before that the whole proceedings is online, and you have the URL to take a look at it. Even I do not take from people their copyright, so the names of and email addresses of every speaker is listed there. So even if you do not have direct access to any of the memberships, you can always contact the individual speakers, because often they are willing to share their presentations anyway. So my goal is not to keep it behind a firewall forever, but give you the full access of information, so that if you need to, you can contact the speakers and get the material. Talking about counterfeit and which going beyond electronics. So of course we can think of counterfeit handbags and shoes and all the other luxury goods and apparel all the time. Beyond that, we start seeing all the other types of materials. I mean, this is literally talking about nuts and bolts, and even U.S. Postal Service found this situation of constructions of its headquarters. And if you look at the date of this, it's 1989. It's before we started even talking about counterfeit electronics. This building material, there is actually a group in University of Florida. They are working on this building material quite a bit. And one of these things, I have seen several reports from many of the boom Middle Eastern countries, where they're of course growing at a rate faster than anything, and with less chance of being able to check all the things that are coming in, and a lot of reports on counterfeit building materials, from steel to concrete to every piece of it. We have seen, and this is actually, we have worked in our labs, and there is actually currently a separate bearing industry working group on counterfeit bearings. Same with things like water pumps. Now we slowly come towards closer to electronics, and a lot of issues to do with things where there's a lot of customer demand, even from people like us. So would be things of the nature of drums and print inks and things of that nature are regularly counterfeited. More scary, medical devices, airbags. We are getting more and more into personal safety and health issues. This is, I would say, really heinous, is material for the fire protection material in firefighter suits, which can really put them in danger, because these things degrade a lot faster than good material. So previous one, the firefighter material, was to do with the DuPont plastic. And this is again to do with, again, a DuPont plastic. Of course, that's a popular material, but remember the word plastic, because we'll come back to it again and again. So this was a case of course, a super luxury car, this Aston Martin. They had to recall thousands of cars, and it is a big deal because they actually do make thousands of cars. And why did it happen? Because it is reported that the accelerator pedal arm was made by a wrong material. Now, I'm not a lawyer to say that it is counterfeit, so its claim is it's counterfeit, but look at the bottom, that beyond the auto parts, the same firm makes parts for medical, electronics, home appliance, and industrial application industries. So even if it is not a counterfeit and just an honest mistake, the result can go across many different industries. And the real issue is now to manage your supply chain and know where it's coming from. Getting closer into the areas of our interest, there had been reports of counterfeit parts in Russian MiGs, and of course there has been reports of counterfeit parts in our defense system material too. This is where we come closer and closer to the cyber physical system issues, where it's the issue of counterfeit network devices, where it can, if tampered with, such a device can read into everything what we possess and maintain. Getting closer to electronics, you see I talk about batteries, wires, and switchgear. What's common with these three things? These are not directly what we would consider electronic components like ICs and passive devices, but all of them make the part of overall electrical infrastructure. And in all three of these cases, the key thing is there are safety issues, because in all these cases there are fire hazards associated with loss of insulation resistance, loss of proper contacts. So these are really issues, although not electronic component directly, but something of concern. So let's talk a little bit about the shape of the volume of counterfeiting. And here is a page. This is from 2013. This was a DHS presentation from the San Diego office. If you look at it, you will see that the top items, 29% are apparel, 16% would be some sort of consumer electronics, then software, then when it comes to electronics, computer related things, it's about 3% toward the right hand side. There are a couple of reasons for it. Of course, just the volume of such items may be big, the fashion items and apparels, but also those industries had been very active with the enforcement agencies in demanding that government always take action for these seizures. So one of the ways to think about these statistics is not just look at the numbers, because government will never capture, or it's not possible for them to capture every single counterfeit material crossing our border or within the country. But only way we can get more attention is if we, as a part of the supply chain of electronic components, get ourselves heard by the agencies. Here is, I am assuming most of you have heard of Government Industry Data Exchange Program, where mostly I would say voluntarily people do report of counterfeit electronic parts. And if you look at these numbers, and the left hand, the y-axis here is raw numbers. It's not in thousands or millions or anything like that. So if you just looked at this number and somebody told you the maximum counterfeit parts reported was in 2010 and that was less than 250, I would say there is no problem here. Let's move on. But we all know this is just a tip of the iceberg. So a bigger data source had been ERAI, and this is a slide that Mark Snyder of ERAI presented last December, and which roughly shows, again, order of magnitude higher, but still about 1,000 or so per year in the recent years in counterfeit parts reporting. So this gives you that it is much bigger than the GUIDEP, and we have seen extrapolated numbers which are much bigger. But the way I look at it, it's not the number specifically that matters to us. That may matter to, again, law enforcement and policymakers, but for us to look at what causes it. And this is a summary from ERAI. They come up with saying the 72% of their reported counterfeit parts in their system in the 13 years of this century are discontinued parts, and about 12% are active parts that are still available, and rest could not be determined. So even if the rest which could not be determined, I take them as active, it's about 3 out of 4 to be discontinued parts. So that remains one of the main risk factors for a part being counterfeit. Think of it this way. This part, I'm just showing a snapshot. All of these have become, it's a straightforward op-amp, became discontinued toward the end of 90s. And now, if you were to really hurting to search for these parts, you are likely to fall for something like a solicitation like this, that, yeah, I can supply any part and I can get you all of these parts. It's rather easy to fall for this type of source if you are not ready with the obsolescence issue. So that particular part, when I search for it, I find, oh, this part is available from 20 different sources and a lot of quantity, but look at the names of those organizations. I never heard of them. So the risk factor then becomes from my not being ready for obsolescence, trying to make a distressed purchase, and getting to suppliers I never heard of, and then determining whether to buy from them or not. Now, when you look at a company like that, you might even find their website, and they might claim there things like, we have $100 million of available inventory for your availability crisis, really pitching to you. But then, this is a slide from Fred Shipp when he was at MDA. So he looked at about 200 more plus independent distributors and found that some of them have just residential address. That is bad enough for a distributor to have a residential address, but then he finds them, many of those residential addresses really have a commercial mailbox as business address. So this gets you the situation. You do not want to be in a situation where you need to buy from organizations like this. And what is our supply chain now? We cannot just say supply chain is somebody I can call up and know, because the whole process of electronics manufacturing, or any manufacturing for that matter, is completely global, and it comes from everywhere. And if we look at this slide, you have probably seen this version of it a lot of time before. So in the electronic supply chain, we typically have an authorized supply chain and an unauthorized. And the authorized supply chain is through the original part manufacturer, OCM, and through the authorized distributors. And that looks rather straightforward. But then again, when you are in a distressed situation, you may not get that part from the authorized source and try to get from the unauthorized source. And there, the sources can be so many things, including parts scraps, recycled, and you get yourself into a risk not just of counterfeit parts, but of parts of dubious storage history and reliability problems. Having said all that, buying from the electronic authorized distribution still remains one of your best options of avoiding counterfeit part. However, determining whether a distributor is authorized or not is not as straightforward as you hope it is. So you should check. There are two different websites that I mentioned, this ECIAauthorized.com. This is maintained by the Electronic Component Association and Distributors Association, primarily focusing on passive parts, and the authorizeddirectory.com, that is maintained through SIA, Semiconductor Industry Association. And SIA also came up with a booklet some time back. I'm not sure when they last updated, and an authorized directory. There's a few things you have to keep in mind when you go through this. You need to make sure you are looking for authorized distributor for a specific part, because you cannot assume a particular distributor to be authorized for every single part that they sell. So you do not care if they're an authorized distributor for company X if you are buying the product of company Y. So this would be something that you can and should use, and many of these cases, of course, they try to also provide you an kind of purchase portal, but that's not a requirement that you purchase through them. Now, what makes the things more interesting and complicated is you do not always buy parts from a distributor at all. I mean, this is an example of an aerospace supply chain, which is probably an unique case, but it does happen in other cases too. The original OEM may have bought it from an authorized distributor, and after that, that authorized OEM may have sold his extra parts to a broker, and then it goes to another OEM. So right now, when this platform integrator like a Cessna or Embraer is buying from that other OEM, it may or may not know the history of this part, that it has passed through an unauthorized distribution channel at some point in time. It is this platform integrator's responsibility to assess that history and also the other OEM in their practices as a distributor. Because whoever you are buying from is the distributor for you. It does not matter whether that person is an OEM or a maintenance facility. You have to look at them, how they took care of the parts, do they have the information about the parts, and things of that nature. Here are a couple of other examples. Here is a list of part distributor assessment factors. This is a list that from that is CALCE Research Handbook. Now you will find that many other distributor assessment tools like the DLS, QSLD, or even SAE standards have a lot of other details built into the assessment. But however you look at it, all those assessments roughly takes care of these 8 characteristics anyway. So I'm not saying that this is the end of it, but all distributors need to be assessed for at least these factors. But the exact questionnaire that you use, the exact methodology that you use, it's up to you. So the point I want to make is though, number one, you need to plan ahead of obsolescence, because that's the cause of distressed purchase. Number two, your distributor is the organization that you are buying from. It may not be a distributor in its signboard. It may not be a distributor formally, but if you are buying from a maintenance facility some parts, you still need to look at these parameters for that maintenance facility to see if how they control storage, the storage and handling, and can they give you part traceability. It doesn't matter who is selling you. Then other issue that often comes into this question, people do a lot of assessment of distributors, even audits for large authorized distributors, but when it comes to buying this small number of parts from a small company, they would waive it as a business practice or a government contracting practice, that because it's a small business, because it has certain other kind of check marks, we don't need to assess them. No matter what size of is your purchase and what size is the supplier, you need to assess them using your full set of tools. Then it is generally not possible to make this full assessment at the point of purchase. You don't have the time. You have to make a decision in 7 days. So you have to make the pre-selection of who you are going to buy from ahead of time. That is, even if you are okay to buy from independent distributors and brokers, but you have to assess them ahead of time. And finally, you have to determine if you are sticking with buying from authorized distributor, that if the distributor is authorized for the specific part that you are purchasing. Next topic, there is a little bit of, I'm finding, sense of urgency in the law enforcement. In DHS, DOD, and even Department of Energy, there are many offices which are concentrating on some level of counterfeit part issues. 3 weeks back, I was invited for a half-a-day session on counterfeit electronics in an event organized by FBI, where the other topics were things like trade secret theft, ITAR control, export control, so issues of more law enforcement type, but they are warming up to the issue that we need to look at counterfeit electronics and topics of that nature. So you can contact me for getting in touch with the right kind of people who are leading these efforts, and I'll be happy to do that. But in general, these two government websites are generally the federal government entities encourage. This IPR Center works through many of the divisions and departments so that you can get your ideas in one place or complaints in one place. And same with the cybercrime, that includes not just components but also other issues including identity thefts and things of that nature. Next, I have a couple of examples. I don't need to read through them, but so Visiontek was one of the big cases of interest, one of the first to be prosecuted for counterfeit electronic parts. Key thing to think of, this was not a Chinese company, this was an American company. So this whole idea that we can stop counterfeit purchase just by avoiding from country X or country Y is not going to work. Number two, once they figured out a way to counterfeit, it's not one company or other, they counterfeited material from many, many companies as I list here. I'm kind of skipping over this page with the specific detail, you can read them. But they had listed 1,100 companies in their worldwide customer list and 867 US companies on their customer list. And in those customer lists, they had literally who's who of the independent distribution. So you cannot just take a look at a company that they are members of certain trade groups. Doesn't mean those trade groups are able to vet every single member. You have to look at those companies individually. What was the big cautionary tale for me? These 5 parts I list here, these are some parts which are listed in the Visiontek indictment. And these parts were actually available for purchase when I did the investigation from either the authorized distributor or directly from the manufacturer or from authorized aftermarket supplier. So people are not doing real homework, and that's why they got into this problem. This is another relatively recent case of selling to Navy and getting busted. This is a positive case. They tracked them for a while, and now this gentleman will be making some prison time besides doing restitution, and the NAVC who did the investigation, they will actually post all the reports in GuideUp for people to review later. Third item I wanted to point out is the SAE standards. So SAE started on this work several years back, and they came up with the standard AS5553, which was one of the first to list basic topics and definitions and ideas. It's under revision, and in some ways it will probably always be under revision. Then there was one more standard, which I will have some more in a little bit to call AS6174. This is for material, that is everything other than electronics. Now that document is also under revision again. Then there was one standard 6081 for independent distributors and brokers assessment. One standard currently going on, and it's actually going to get to ballot anytime now, it's for authorized distributors, because authorized distributors found that they also need to have some level of assessment internally for their customers, for themselves, so they came up with this. And finally, a test method, AS6171. So I have personally been involved most with the AS6171, and within that AS6171, the purpose is to standardize practices, because Otherwise, every test lab with a couple of microscopes could claim that we can do counterfeit detection. So it is to come up with basic methods and laboratories techniques and operators skill sets. So these are the test methods that are in SAE 6171. Every single test method individually has been balloted on, and the overall, what we call the main document, is currently under balloting and should be out later this year. And I have been personally involved. I'm very fond of it, but at the same time, this is the details about the counterfeit material 6174. It has some similarities with 5553 and also some level of laboratory techniques built in, and this is under major update now. However, almost all these inspection techniques, as much as they are very thorough and detailed, you need something to compare it with. Sometimes the time and cost may outweigh the benefit, and there can be part damages and things of that nature. So next few pages, I'm not going to read through, but just to mention to you, and maybe I should just show you this JEDEC standard. Just a cover page to show this process change notification by, here they call solid state suppliers, pretty much all OCMs. That's one of the least used tool for counterfeit avoidance. And so the JEDEC standard has some requirements. It requires that when these major changes are made, the companies inform you. And it gives some of the minimum content of the PCNs that should be included. Now, many companies do track PCNs, but for purpose of reliability assessment qualification. But PCNs can be a good tool for the purpose of counterfeit detection because it tells you about what changes are made. So just for example, if I know the mold compound of a component, it's supposed to be made by company A and part number ABC, whereas when I check the mold compound, I find that to be not the case. So one of the first thing would be, I can say this is a high risk. So I can actually track the PCNs, create a timeline of change of the parts. This is an example timeline that this Altera FPGA was introduced in 2000 with certain mold compound. It was Shinetsu. Then in 2002 there was some change, 2006 some change, 2008. Now I have a timestamp and timeline, and I can check back on whether a part is counterfeit or not by its date code. However, can you do that when you just get the part in hand? You can't, unless you have the history already built in. So that's why we are working on a database of the mold compounds and the parts and the PCNs, linking them together so that when I get a part in hand, and these are the kind of information we are putting in the database. So when I get a part in hand, I can query by the part number and date code, find what the mold compound is, find what its properties are, and make a quick judgment on whether or not that part is of high counterfeit risk or not. So this is something which is different from the many inspection techniques. This is one check and we can make a risk assessment. But for it to work, we need this database. And of course, this is a basic database structure, how we link things up. And we can, once I have that kind of information, I can run a whole lot of searching, testing, evaluation, laboratory selection with this database. So we are getting this database ready, and we have support from DoD to develop it. But in future, I'm looking at validation of the database, population of the database, and to be able to share it in a reciprocal manner with companies who are hoping to use it. And any suggestions are welcome on how we can work it out within the industry for making this database engine and the information useful for all. So One might say, oh, you are a one-trick pony with only mold compounds. But take a look at this. There are changes in many other things. There is changes in package material. There is changes in simple package marking. So we can actually make a combination of not just mold compound, but changes in many different combinations, and going by the timeline, try to create, or why try to create a set of possible and impossible material combinations that will allow me to relatively quickly judge whether a part is counterfeit or not. So that is one question. I leave it open for all the attendees. If you have any suggestion or more interest in finding out how we can make this thing collaboratively available to the industry. I think I'm really eating into Jeff's time. So the authentication piece of it, as I mentioned, I'll probably have to just leave it here, and I will be okay to answer questions on that directly or separately over email. Let me go toward the one portion of this authentication tools. So some of you may have heard of this term DNA and that as an authentication tool. Here, just as an engineer and reliability engineer, these are the few things I point out that absolutely needs to be done so that an authentication tool will be acceptable to the industry. And number two is it needs to be more than just counterfeit detection. And I list here several things that can be done or should be done through authentication. Here are some of my concerns, positives and negatives, as we look ahead. That we'll have shorter time for availability of components, making it harder to make those obsolescence judgment and those decisions. Geographic sources, other types of counterfeiting. But I look at on the positive side, many companies, the management is now tuned to the fact there is a counterfeit electronics problem. But as we know, it's not just counterfeit electronics. It can be any type of component or bad quality that can be an issue. Let's take advantage, if I can use the word, of this crisis to make sure that we inform everybody how we can kind of rebuild our quality systems within our organizations to detect bad parts, to create a better obsolescence management systems, and also think of the last thing. Maybe most of you are not OCMs, but you make a product. It can be a toaster, it can be an avionics box. Try to get into the process of stopping counterfeiting of your products, because that may be the thing, but you are the target. And last, I have some information about upcoming event of our center and things that we offer. And I'd like to thank our sponsors and customers who have been helping this research over the years. I know I have gone a little bit over time, but I want to yield it back to Jeff now. So Jeff, I'm going to make you the presenter then.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Das. What I'll do is let's go through some of these questions here before I get into the the demo of the tool or anything like that, since our time is running a little short. Let's see here. Well, actually, several of you have asked about if the presentation will be made available, and so yes, no worries there. All the attendees will get a copy of the presentation. Here's one. In 1998, Intel found some people in, I assume that means Taiwan, made fake Intel processors with older version chips and sold it as newer version chips. So the attendee is just asking if you had heard that story and had any comments relating to this.
Yes,
type of activity.
Actually, I did hear about that story, and one of the things Intel did then was, as a response, is to have an unique identifier built in, which they share with the direct purchasers of the Intel chip, so that they can actually test it, that it is authentic immediately. So I know I skipped over the authentication issues, but in some ways, at least for the processor market, that is kind of getting built in. And that case, what they did was lower frequency chip, they marked it as a higher frequency, and you will probably laugh at it, probably looking at those. Those were in those megahertz frequencies, but even then there was a price differential, and that's why it was counterfeited. But that actually Intel used that example actually in AMD too, to build in a secure supply chain between them and their authorized customers.
Okay. Someone else is making the observation, many of the visual techniques do not provide definitive means of identifying a part as being counterfeit. Can you talk about other options besides visual inspection?
So no one technique should be determinative in counterfeit detection. So, but a couple of items besides visual are material characterization that I dwelled on a little bit, because anything, be it the outside lid finish, to the lead material, to the say the die attach material, if you're looking internally, they are specific materials, and making a judgment there whether it's supposed to be the authentic one or not can help us. Other key thing to think of is, again, putting on the hat of component engineer. I do not need to gather evidence that I can prosecute somebody in the court of law, but I can gather information in a way that helps us in determining whether it's a high risk of counterfeit. So when I'm at that point, two things do not match, I can move on, that I do not want to use this and go to the next step. But material characterization and electrical will of course be two of the other things I would mention.
Okay, and let's do another one, and then I'll show a little bit of how we represent counterfeits in our tools.
Yeah, and I can answer the rest of the questions by email to everybody in the audience.
Okay. Well, here's one that's you know, rather interesting. You know, you've covered the, you know, buyer beware in terms of unauthorized sources and brokers and things like that. Someone is asking about, has there been any history? Do you know of any situations where counterfeit or substandard parts have actually come from a franchised or an authorized distributor?
I say that yes with a long tone, because it has been reported, and that's one of the reasons why the authorized distributors have also agreed to come up with their own standards. And the claim had been that the authorized distributors have the issue of improper returns from other customers who may have returned parts not from the authorized channel. So I would say there had been a couple of pretty solid cases where one might say things have been from authorized distributors, but even after that, the risk from authorized distribution had been pretty low. But one cannot say that it is never. It never happened. It probably happened.
Okay. All right. So I'll switch gears here. You have made me the presenter. So let me share my screen. And you know, very quick, just a couple of pages to talk about how we represent counterfeit information within our tools. And I'm just moving some windows around here so I can get to everything. So at the individual part level, for those of you who already, you know, are existing customers, you know about our part search for single parts versus BOM manager for spreadsheet in, spreadsheet out analysis. But one of the categories of information you see along here on the left side is counterfeit risk. So here's an example where this part was reported counterfeit. There was a known issue. You can see we take a look at, are there reports at the specific part number that you're interested in versus, you know, the supplier in general and the type of parts. You know, we have also found that it's the older parts, not necessarily obsolete, but certainly the older ones and the ones close to becoming obsolete that are at most risk of being obsoleted. We also did some research into the supply chain story, and this was almost economics 101, right? The parts with a current and historical shortage of authorized inventory tend to get counterfeited more than the others, right? It's basic supply and demand economics. But in terms of clicking through for the supplemental information and reports, we do use GuideUp primarily. We also use, industry news and reports and things like this. But GuideUp is a prime source. So here's a case where the description, here's a company, Impact Components. I believe they're a distributor. They purchased this particular part. Here's the reason why they felt that, it was a potential counterfeit. Including part markings. The part markings were crooked. So we've got a counterfeit risk assessment built into our tools, showing the situation for the specific part, as well as an overall assessment depending on life cycle and supply chain factors. We did get asked by one of our contract manufacturing customers a couple of years back now to add part marking into the mix. So we do have part marking, as we just saw in the case of this particular part. It was one of the things that was used to identify it as a suspect counterfeit report. Other use cases are just incoming, receiving, and inspection, making sure you received what you thought you ordered. Part markings do come into play there. And we also heard Dr. Das talk about the risk analysis, right? Not being ready for obsolescence is a problem when it comes to counterfeit issues. It's the obsolete and the parts soon to be obsolete that tend to have the biggest areas of concern. So what we do at SiliconExpert, we report on the status of the part. In this case, this one is not recommended for new design, which is close. It's the next step before last time buy, which is the next step before being obsolete. We also have a predictive years to end of life analysis as well. But we also have this notion of overall risk that factors in other things besides just life cycle. Sometimes looking at life cycle in a vacuum can be a little dangerous. If a part's active, it's not always as good as it looks. You might not see it get our best possible score, because if it's a sole source part with no scent of authorized inventory, if it's environmentally non-compliant and there's no compliant alternative, then that is some red flags there that would make the score higher than you might think. We've also seen the reverse on obsolete parts. A part may be obsolete, years to end of life is 0 because it's already there, but it may not get the worst possible overall score, because even though it's obsolete, there still may be plenty in inventory, including authorized aftermarket sources. There may be plenty of drop-in replacements from other suppliers, still having adequate inventory. So the takeaway from this is sometimes active is not as good as it looks, and sometimes obsolete is not as bad as it looks when you factor in supply chain multi-sourcing and environmental risk factors. In terms of being able to do such assessments at a bill of material level, as opposed to at the individual BOM level, in our BOM management tool, you have the ability to upload BOMs and do part validation and scrubbing and obsolescence analysis and a variety of different types of analysis, one of them being specific to counterfeit. So here in the export section, this is basically a laundry list of all the things you can do to make a custom report. So, counterfeit risk is one of the many areas that you can do that, right? So maybe a counterfeit risk associated with, life cycle risk would be, an idea. Predicted obsolescence year, let's say, for example. Conflict minerals is another one that was the subject of our last webinar. But the point is, pick and choose, country of origin. This is another one that we've added most recently. And so then at the BOM level, as opposed to the individual part level, you can get your answers and assessments regarding counterfeit, regarding life cycle, including links to the part markings and things like this, right? So this is the predictive obsolescence year. This is the counterfeit risk, and this is the overall counterfeit reports, column T. Column U would be, okay, there's no counterfeit reports on this specific part on my BOM, but what about the supplier, and what about the product line, which is column V. How many authorized distributors have stock right now? So if you have a high number of authorized distributors, even if the risk assessment is high, obviously that would be where you would want to try to make your purchase from. What's been the supply chain story? If it's a military part, is there a commercial part available? Things like that are part of what we have built inside our tool. So that's just a very high level, quick explanation of how we have this type of information available within our products. We are at the end of our allotted time currently. If we did not get to your questions, they will be answered in a separate email. The presentation will also be made to everyone. So I'd like to thank everyone for your time and attendance today. Apologize if we did not get to your specific question, but it will be answered. Thank you, Dr. Das, for hosting this seminar, sharing a lot of good information. A lot of the questions were not questions. It was just comments about, positive comments toward your presentation. So thank you to our organizers, presenters, and attendees. This will conclude our webinar for today.